All right, welcome back. Hopefully you have checked in with your vocab notebook and filled in the slides about the 6 different kingdoms in there, as well as binomial nomenclature. So now that we are kind of aware of different types of organisms that are on this planet, we can start to talk about the interactions between these different types of organisms, as well as the interactions between these organisms and their environment, which is what ecology is. So, like I said, ecology is the study of relations of organisms to one another and their physical surroundings. So, how do they interact with each other? So, like cat versus dog, as well as like cats live in a certain niche and dogs live in a different niche. So we need to be aware of what a population is according to science, but it's the number of individuals of a species that live in a particular area at one time. So we can look at the population of humans as a whole on this planet. We can break it down into countries within the United States. We can break that down into states. Within states, we can break that down into counties. Within counties, we can break it down into like blocks of a street, or we can break it down into like different classrooms inside of a school building. So it's basically however many individuals of that species are in that one location at one time. And so populations can be distributed in their space in 3 different ways. So number 1 is even distribution. So that's kind of like how we're going to have our desks set up in rows 6 feet apart from each other. Everyone is evenly spaced 6 feet apart from the other person. And so that's what even distribution looks like for a population. You can have clumped distribution, and this is what you see in most groups. So this might be like if you went to a party or social gathering, you'll have like little groups or little cliques of people talking and chatting to one another. And so they're still within a space, but it's just like one clump here, one clump there, etc. And the last type of distribution is random. So there's really no pattern going on. So also in order to talk about populations and how populations might change, we need to be aware of the birth rate, death rate, growth rate, and what immigration and emigration is. So these are different factors that will affect population size. And so when we are studying populations, we do have to be aware of how big they are, like how many members of the population there are, so that we can better study and understand it. So the birth rate is the number of organisms being born in a certain period of time. So this is like over the year of 2020, so many humans were born, and that would be our birth rate. Death rate is the number of organisms dying in a certain period of time. So again, during the year 2020, so many humans died, and that would be our death rate. Growth rate would be the birth rate minus the death rate. So you want to see either the population increasing or decreasing. The idea is if the birth rate is greater than the death rate, then the population is increasing. You'll get a positive number. If the birth rate is lower than the death rate, you're going to get a negative number, and that means the population is decreasing. So immigration with an I, immigration, is when organisms in the population move away. So if you are currently in the United States and you're moving to Canada, you would say, I immigrated from the United States. Excuse me. Emigration would be organisms entering into a population. So if we go back to that example of moving from the US to Canada, you would say, I'm emigrating into the Canadian population. And so again, in terms of population size, yes, you can have a birth rate and a death rate, but organisms can move from one population to another. And that's going to affect the population size as well. So when we are looking at population size and population growth, there's a couple things we need to be aware of. So for a population, you can experience exponential growth, and that's this graph right here. This is when there's a lot of resources available and it's almost like unlimited in the habitat that they're living in. And so you'll see a drastic increase in population size that grows at a very, very high rate. However, you cannot maintain exponential growth for very long because, like I said, it comes down to how many resources are available. You can also have logistic growth. And this is when a population increases until the availability of resources becomes a problem and the population stabilizes. That's what you're seeing in this graph over here. So this first part right here is your exponential growth. And then as the resources start to get used up, you see the growth rate start to level off and plateau. Now, when the population size plateaus, that means that you are at carrying capacity. So that means the environment can't handle any more of that type of species in that habitat. This is when the death rate equals the birth rate. And so the environment will usually limit the size of the population. And this is what we're starting to see with humans on this planet. We really are reaching carrying capacity. And if we continue to grow the population of humans, that's when we're starting to see these really like detrimental things happening to the environment. So now we're going to be talking about different relationships between different species. So one you might be familiar with is predation. So this is when one organism kills another organism for food. So this is predator and prey relations. So the snake is your predator, the mouse is the prey. The snake kills the mouse to eat the mouse. You can have what is called parasitism, or you might have had a parasite before. And this is when one organism feeds off of and usually lives on or in another organism. So a great example of this is a tick, especially in the summertime. Ticks will attach themselves to our skin and burrow into our skin to feed off of our blood. So they'll like live kind of like in or halfway into our skin and eat our blood to sustain themselves. So now we're looking at something called symbiosis. And then symbiosis is when two or more species live together in a long-term relationship. And then there's two types of symbiotism. So again, two species are living together in a long-term relationship. So one type of symbiosis is mutualism, and this is when both species benefit. So for example, bees will go and eat the nectar out of flowers. However, they also help to spread the pollen of the flowers. So bees get a food source and flowers get a way to reproduce with other flowers. So they're helping each other. This little bird right here with the alligator, the bird will like pick through the alligator's teeth and get some food from eating off of the alligator's teeth. And in return, the alligator gets clean teeth, which kind of a crazy relationship, but it's out there. So the other type of symbiosis is commensalism. And so this is when one species benefits, but the other one is neither harmed nor helped. So they're living together, one species gets benefit from it, it doesn't really affect the other species. And you actually see this as an example in Finding Nemo. The clownfish likes to live in the sea anemone. And so by the clownfish living in the sea anemone, it gets a home and it's protected because remember, it like nips at you a little bit. I think it either burns you or like electrocutes you. I forget which one, but it's not pleasant to touch a sea anemone. However, the clownfish is immune to it. So it's able to like swim into it. And so it gets a home and protection, but the sea anemone is unharmed. It's just like there. All right. So those are relationships between organisms, but now we can also classify organisms into categories based on the energy that they add or use to an ecosystem. So you can have a producer, which is a type of organism that makes its own food. So this is going to be things like plants, and you'll also see this with algae and some bacteria. So they photosynthesize, they make their own food. Now, consumers are an organism that eat other organisms. So this is most animals. we have to eat other animals or we have to eat plants in order to survive. So you can have like different levels of consumers, and we'll get into this on a further slide. But like I said, either a consumer is eating a plant or a consumer is eating another animal that eats a plant. So there's a lot of predation going on. And then finally, you can have a decomposer. So this is mostly your fungi. And this is an organism that eats or breaks down dead organisms and waste. So if we look at like the energy balance on this planet, producers are eaten by what we call primary consumers. So primary consumers only eat plants. However, secondary consumers will eat primary consumers. And then we have tertiary consumers that will eat secondary consumers, and so on. So that's what this diagram right here is showing you. We have producers down here. What are these bugs? Crickets, maybe? I don't know. These bugs will eat the plant, so they're a primary consumer. We then have mice, I think. These mice will eat these bugs as a secondary consumer. And then we have this owl, which will eat the mice as a tertiary or third level consumer. Now, the reason why this is important to think about is because of the amount of energy that is available. So I'm talking about like fuel and food. When you move from one level to the next, so from producer to primary consumer, only 10% of the energy can be transferred. So from this plant level, let's say that there's like 100 units of energy. That means that there's only available for primary consumers 10% of that. So 10% of 100 is 10 units of energy. That's all that's available to the primary consumer. And the idea is that as you move up the food chain, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, we're getting to food chains. As you move up the food chain, there can be less and less of that type of species because there's less energy to support that type of species. So the higher you are, the less of you there are supposed to be. So this is when we can get into food chains. You guys like that transition right there? So basically, a food chain shows how organisms are related with each other by the food that they eat. And the arrow points towards the predator. That's really important to remember. So if we look at this food chain right here, we start with a green plant. And this is telling us, because of the arrow, that the insect eats the green plant. So it's pointing in the direction that the energy is going, or it's pointing towards the predator. Now, from here, insects transfer their energy or they get eaten by fish. These small fish transfer their energy or they get eaten by big fish. Big fish transfer their energy or get eaten by eagles. And then once the eagle dies, the bacteria will decompose the eagle. And so the energy gets transferred to the bacteria. And so the same thing works with these other two food chains right here. So you will get some practice with food chains, but basically, whichever direction the arrow is pointing, that's your predator. Now, you can make it a little bit more realistic and create a food web. So this is basically acknowledging the fact that for some organisms, one organism might have more than one type of predator. And so it's showing you this slightly more complicated relationship between different types of organisms. So it looks like we are starting here with our primary producer of phytoplankton and algae. So from here, algae gets eaten by zooplankton, and then zooplankton can be eaten by three different things. So zooplankton can be eaten by baleen whales or the humpback whale. Zooplankton can also be eaten by crustaceans, which are shrimp and crabs. Zooplankton can also be eaten by sea urchins and sea cucumbers. Oh, there's four. Or zooplankton can be eaten by shellfish. So this is, again, just acknowledging that there's multiple predators for one organism. And that's what the food web is showing you. Now, the important part here is to look at what happens if one type of organism gets eliminated from the food web. How does that affect the other organisms in the food web? So, for example, if we eliminated zooplankton no longer exists. That basically means that humpback whales lose a food source, crustaceans lose a food source, sea urchins lose a food source, and shellfish lose a food source, which means that all the organisms that eat those organisms also lose a food source, and so everybody dies. That's the type of relationship we're looking at here. It's the circle of life. Speaking of circles, we can also look at the cycles of inorganic matter in an ecosystem. So this is the water cycle, basically how water is able to recycle through an organism. I'm going to let you look at the diagram and see for yourself. You don't really need to be responsible for the details within these cycles, but you have to know that they exist. So you have the water cycle, which is, evaporation, precipitation, all of that stuff. I have a song if you're interested. You can have the carbon cycle. So again, this is how carbon recycles through an ecosystem. This is important when we're talking about pollution and fossil fuels, because the burning of fossil fuels releases carbon into the atmosphere, and that's what's causing a lot of the pollution and the disruption in the ozone. And then we can also have the nitrogen cycle. So again, this is how nitrogen filters through the ecosystem. And this has to do a lot with animal waste as well. And so part of it is getting the bacteria what they need down here. So again, if it comes up on MCAS, most likely you're going to see the carbon cycle or the water cycle. However, it doesn't usually come up on the MCAS. So at this point, please make sure you're checking in with your vocab notebook and you are filling out the appropriate slides. But I think this is the last video. So thanks for watching me all year.